And I have the pleasure of introducing the presenter for this session, Daryl Wilburn. Daryl is managing partner of Honsha Associates. Daryl was a leader in the development and implementation of some of the Toyota Motor Manufacturing's highest profile leadership development programs. Daryl led the Toyota Way 2001 implementation at Toyota's largest manufacturing plant in North America. Daryl worked with the Toyota Institute in Japan to develop the Toyota business practice, leading the global pilot of this program as well as the North American senior executive sessions. While at Toyota, Daryl studied the Toyota production system as a student of OMDD, Toyota's internal sensei group. Daryl was also part of the team that launched Toyota Motor Manufacturing Texas, where he led the assimilation and training of new leaders to Toyota management. Daryl is also co-author and co-editor of the recently released book, Toyota by Toyota. Please let's give a welcome hand to Daryl.
Thank you, thank you. I'm not quite sure where to stand up here. There's a podium and then there's these tables. I'm afraid I'm going to trip. So if I do, I think we do have someone on standby to come pick me up if that should happen. It's nice to see some familiar faces. Honsha, the group that I'm a part of, works in the state of Washington currently with the Department of Labor and Industry. And yeah, woo! So it's good to see some friendly faces out there. That's the good news. The bad news for them is that they've probably seen all of this before. And if you have any questions about some of the reality of it, maybe just ask those guys that just identified themselves for you. So that's a good thing. Honsha is an association of former Toyota employees. We have offices in the U.S. and also in Japan and South America. We work with companies that range from state government to healthcare. Also, we work obviously with manufacturing companies as well. I even had a client once that, believe it or not, processed human cadavers for use in surgeries. That was a very interesting Gemba walk, if any of you are familiar with that term. So that's a little about us. What do we do? You know, we try to balance ourselves along the continuum of lean services, from lean assessment to coaching to trainer and agent certification, and also to training and workshops as well. So that's just a little bit about Honsha, as you can see. Sammy Obara, who is also out at our table, we put together a book over the past few months called Toyota by Toyota, which was not our choice of titles. The publisher thought that would be a good title. And this is the #1 bestseller in the Wilburn and the Obara household. I don't know about anywhere else, but I have a lot of these books under my desk at home. So we also have a coupon code from the publisher as well. So a little bit about I mentioned Sammy's out there too. Anybody get a chance to play with the nails? Yeah. So I'm rethinking my strategy. I don't know how smart it was to come here and humiliate people with the nail puzzle. But if you would like a little bit of humility, please feel free to step out to the table and try the nail puzzle. You win the grand prize of a nominally priced pen. I think that's the guideline, right, for the state. It's got to be nominal in value. And also a Post-it note, so you can get that as well. So let me ask you something about problem solving. Does this look familiar to you when you think about problem solving in your organization? Something isn't working, so you say, is it working? Yes, don't mess with it, no problem, you get that? Or if it's no, the question is, did you mess with it? Will it blow up in your hands? No, look the other way, no problem, you got that? Sometimes you get, did you mess with it? Yes. Yeah, so let's cover it up. If it's no, does anyone else know? If so, can you hide it? No problem, right? Sometimes it's yes, will it blow up in your hands? Well, you're in trouble again. And then can you blame someone else? If it is, no problem. Is that familiar? Now, from a lean perspective, we love problems. So this wouldn't really go well in our environment. So I want to tell you a little story today about in my time at Toyota, we came to this realization that we had possibly gone a little too fast in some of our activities and in our growth around the world. And so we had to do some recalibration, and one part of that recalibration we called the Toyota Way 2001, which I'll show you a little bit of that. And then we also said we have to show what we know, and that became our Toyota business practice, which is the opposite of this conventional problem solving. So just to make sure that we're clear on terminology, we're going to talk today about PDCA, and if you think about, well, what is that? It's basically plan, do, check, act, or some people use adjust for the last A. It is not very sexy. It's not very complicated. It's very simple. And it's one of the things we try to do, is to take something that can be made complicated and really make it simple. It's about PDCA. Your doctor does PDCA. When you go to the doctor, you have some symptoms. They try to understand what the symptoms are, give you some diagnosis and a plan, put the plan in place, check and see if they were right, and then adjust if not. Hopefully we're still alive at that point, and we have that opportunity. But this is a real basic methodology and a real basic thinking way. But we also try to think of it as not just a method for solving problems, but as a kind of a flywheel that constantly turns in our brains of our leadership, but also our workers and employees. PDCA, again, simple, easy to understand. But when we think about the simplicity of it, we also know, those of you who have tried to implement, it's hard to make that wheel turn around. There's a great article several years ago by the Harvard Business Review that talked about this Toyota production system, or what we now call lean, really being about this simplistic process. If you haven't seen that article called Decoding the DNA of the Toyota Production System, it's really good, and I would recommend that. But we also think about PDCA not just with simple problems or even mid-level problems, but PDCA is a thinking way for all levels of the organization. I like to call this really the 3 levels of PDCA problem solving. And you've heard today, you heard the governor talk about this morning how important and how vital it is for leadership to provide their own PDCA to this process. And so the first part we call that senior management, and the role and responsibility of senior management in this lean environment is to provide vision and incentive, to set the course, to say this is where we're going, this is how we want to try to get there. The tool that they use for this we call Honsha.ORG. A lot of people call it strategy deployment, but it's the idea of taking that vision, which in a sense is looking at the problems not this year, but next year, and 3 years from now, and 5 years from now. What will those problems be? And how do we need to start maneuvering the organization to solve those future problems? So if we find ourselves as a leadership team being very concerned with firefighting, it could be an indication that we're not doing a sufficient job of doing our role as a senior leadership team in preventing the fires. Looking out into the future. Honsha.ORG is, or policy or strategic deployment, is a PDCA thinking way. Just the same as it would be if you're doing it every day. What do they focus on? Well, I'm going to make an assumption is that we have heard of the 7 wastes before. I know there's even a class this week, these 2 days on the 7 wastes. But one of the things they focus on is 7 wastes, but also, more importantly, senior management with the Honsha outlook looks at overburden and unevenness, what we would call mudri and mudra, which would be how do we make sure that we smooth out the processes so that workers, that are employees, are not overburdened. So it's a little different take. The middle management, they are responsible for daily results. Now, my experience has been that middle management sometimes is one of the toughest groups to win over. And I don't really like that, even that phrase, to win over. But there's a good reason for that. Their job is to protect the agency, to protect the organization, because they're responsible for producing whatever we produce every day. They're responsible for getting the numbers, in a sense. So they're very difficult, and very difficult sometimes to win over to new things because they are taking the responsibility seriously. And I love that. I welcome that. If they just threw everything down and said, yeah, do whatever you want, then I know there's a problem with that. So middle management says, my job is to produce. So the tools that they use from a lean perspective, from a PDCA perspective, we would say are the A3 method, which we'll show you in just a second, A3 PDCA, and also visual management. So if their job is to understand the condition and to raise problems to the surface, then that is a basic tool that they would use. A3 PDCA, visual management. And they focus on the same types of waste: overburden, unevenness, and also the 7 types of waste. For the frontline worker, we say, well, what is their responsibility? Well, we produce results every day. What tools do we have at our disposal from a lean perspective to make that happen? Kaizen is our improvement methodology. Standardized work is our way to understand our condition. How are we doing? Are we ahead? Are we behind? Are we pleasing the customer? Are we not pleasing the customer? And if I have those 2 things in place, I have a vehicle then to solve problems for frontline, and I also have a way to understand my head-behind nature. What do they focus on? Frontline, we say focus on the 7 wastes. So PDCA is not just about one level of the organization. It's about the thinking way up and down the organization and side to side in the organization. It's simple, but it's difficult to actually do it every day. It's a cycle for sure. Now, you also may have heard the term A3 before, and I just want to make sure we're on the same page. PDCA goes with A3 many times in that we try to tell our PDCA story on an 11 by 17 sheet of paper. Not because we're cruel and sadistic. It's because we believe that we need to be very concise in the way we tell our story. Now, does it really matter about the A3? Well, if we solve the problem, maybe not. But if we can also get into the method of clear and concise telling of our story, then we have much better chance of getting the organization behind us. It's been my experience in that. Another article by the Harvard Business Review talked about how Toyota utilizes A3, and from my perspective, we weren't allowed to do anything without having an A3. Now, there's one twist on that. When we were opening the plant in Texas, many times things were going very rapidly, and so I was asked many times, can you put together a quick A4 on that? And my first question was, what's an A4? A4 is this 8.5 by 11 inch sheet of paper. It's real scientific, right? But it simply meant, can you tell like a status report, or can you give us a recommendation just on one sheet of paper? Boil it down to the most important part. So sometimes you hear A3 and PDCA referred to the same time, so that's why. This is an example of an A3 that solves a certain problem. One thing I hope you notice about it is that it's very visual. If we're going to be able to tell a story on a short or a small piece of paper, 11 by 17 piece of paper, we better be able to tell a lot of information in a small amount of space. And those folks in here from L&I can attest to the fact of many, many iterations of A3s that we work together on, coming back and saying, can we eliminate as many words as possible and make that into some picture that we can see? Not clip art, but some picture, some graph that quickly and easily we can tell what the condition is. We can tell what the thinking was. This is an example of that kind of thing. So you can see how we work with data, we try to get the data to tell the story, and we try to present that as an example. I titled part of this presentation, The Revisiting of PDCA. And you might ask, well, why do we need to revisit it? And it's really more about the internal story I started to tell you earlier. In Toyota, we came to that point where we started noticing that people were trying to, in a sense, solve world hunger with their PDCA, with their A3, trying to solve world hunger on one sheet of paper. And as a result, they were trying to cram the smallest of small graphs and the most micro font you could possibly imagine onto one sheet of paper, which really destroyed the message. and wasn't the essence of what we were trying to do. So we took a step back and said, let's really look at what's working well with PDCA and what's not. One of my parts of that was I did a survey of all the North American operations and looked at what PDCA methodologies they were using at the time. And even within a company that prides itself on standardization, there was something like 16 different variations of PDCA being taught within the Toyota group. We thought that was a problem, that we wanted to have a common methodology that was also very flexible in the problems that it could solve. So not just manufacturing problems, but problems in sales, problems in marketing, problems in research and development, also problems in administration, in HR. So we boiled it down to a methodology that helped us in all those areas and made sure that that was spread across the world. And it was an amazing sight to see. Even today, you can go to any plant in the world and see this methodology. Even if you don't speak the language, you can follow the method because it's become the standard. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to revisit. We were doing too much. We wanted to align with the values. We wanted to focus on some key areas that we felt like weren't working well, that people just didn't get the essence of. And I'll share that with you. We wanted to have more of an emphasis on process, not just the result that we were looking at. We wanted to be able to compare those two and say, okay, did we get what we wanted? How did we get what we wanted? Can we repeat it? Can we teach it to other people? Are we developing ourselves? And one of the things that sometimes is missing in the message about lean, and one of the things that I guess gets coded into the DNA when you're actually working in that environment, is that there's two purposes of this lean thing and two purposes of PDCA and problem solving. First purpose is to solve the problem, is to get the result. Second purpose is to build the people in the organization. And there's no better way, from my perspective, no better way to build the people in your organization and thus build the capability and the capacity of your organization than giving people progressively harder and harder problems to solve. That's the other purpose, is so that at the end of that, or as you're progressing up that kind of a stair-step mentality of accomplishment as an organization, each time you take a step, your organization is that much more capable to solve the next problem. And if you could imagine going magically from 1 level to 5 levels up, and someone gave you that option as an organization, would you like to progress 5 levels magically? Most organizations would say, you betcha. But how would you go from that 5th level to the 6th level if you arrive there without building the muscles, in a sense, it would take to go from the 5th level to the 6th level to the 7th level? PDCA is easy, but it's also very hard because it takes a lot of work. And if you don't believe me, ask the people next to you who have done them. Ask some of the L&I people, again, who went through that process that we talked about. So when we talk about aligning with the values, we also had this episode in our history when we look back from a Toyota perspective that we wanted to realign folks with the core principles of what lean, or what we call the Toyota production system, was all about. And those things were the two things: continuous improvement and respect. And the heart of those things we call courage, humility, and Kaizen. So we wanted to align ourselves on the PDCA side, on the problem-solving side, with those values. And so we asked the question, how do you show that you're actually living those values? And our answer was, it's really about the lean business practice that is on top of the principles. How do you show you know the principles? Simply by finding and solving problems, whether you be at the front lines of the organization, in the middle of the organization, or at the leadership level of the organization. That was the job. Again, simple but hard. So let's also talk about, again, simply what's a problem? Well, a problem is a gap between what should be happening and what's actually happening. Now, I was working with an organization once. It was, and this is probably near and dear to many of your hearts. They processed mortgage refinancing. And they were having some trouble with, as some of you may know, with that process. So I went in, my first day there, I was talking to some of the managers, and I asked them the question, are you ahead or behind? And most of them looked at me like I had 7 heads, which may have been true that day, I'm not sure, but they were really shocked. And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, I mean, are you ahead or behind? Are you doing work at a rate that you should be doing? And really they didn't understand. So I knew that we were in the right place at the right time. But without that understanding of how are we doing based on what should be happening, what's actually happening, we can't really do any problem solving. We can't really do any kind of lean processes because we don't have the standard in place. So after a lot of going back and forth, we finally figured out what should be happening. Then we figured out what the gap was, and I asked them the next question, when will we catch up? The answer was quick, never. So that was not an acceptable answer, right? We didn't know the capability or the capacity of the organization. We knew now what we should be doing, but we didn't know and we figured out what the gap was, but now we had to figure out the method to close the gap. So when you're thinking about problems, just as the definition itself, 2 kinds of problems. There's probably more than that, but we would say there's 2 basic kinds. One kind is what we call a setting type problem, where we have this gap between what should be happening and what's actually happening. That's that Kaizen part, to go from the standard to a new standard. Hoshin Kanri is a Kaizen type of problem solving. We raise the standard. That's type 2. Type 1 problem solving is the event type, where we have a standard and we've fallen below. But the same thinking way goes into both types of those problem solving. So it's important to know what our standard is. Are we trying to raise the standard, or are we trying to get back to the standard? Now, let me ask you, those of you who are responsible for departments or groups of people where you work, and I don't expect the answer, but I'll throw the question out anyway. If you're in a condition where you're meeting all the standards, so assuming you have clear standards, everything is in a green condition, everything's in a good condition, then you think about, what's my job as a leader? My job then is to make some red conditions, to make problems, not be a problem. That happens sometimes, but to make a problem. And this sounds really strange to people sometimes. Please just let me take a breath. We just now got all these things in green condition. But that's not the way. The way is to raise the standard. Because if you don't, your customers will, someone else will, the governor will, the legislature will, somebody will raise the standard for you. And then you're scrambling and you're in a reactive mode. So that's why we separate problem into 2 different levels of problem. Type 1, we haven't reached this, we're trying to reach the normal status. Type 2, we're trying to raise it. So we face this issue too. What's the problem with problem? Most people don't even like the word. And I've also noticed a lot of people will say, well, let's say opportunity. It really sounds much nicer. And it does. I can see that. But I told this to one of my teachers at Toyota once, and he looked at me and said, you know, I understand why people do that, but he said, an opportunity you can choose or not. He said, a problem you must solve. So if you're a company or in some cases, and you have the opportunity to go into a new market, yeah, that's an opportunity. You can choose it or not. But if you're getting ready to go out of business, you got to solve the problem. There's no choice. So I like to train and talk to the groups I work with and try to get rid of the problem with the word problem. And from a lean perspective, we love problems. We love them so much, just as we mentioned before, we will make problems where there were no problems before. We will create gaps where there were no gaps before. Because we know if we don't, They will be set for us. Worked with a lot of companies after the initial global economic meltdown. And of course, nobody could have predicted the depth of that, and nobody could have really been in the position to be prepared for that kind of thing. But at the same time, it was also a lesson for a lot of companies in that they never took the chance sometimes to do their own level setting again, to raise their own problems. And they were beset by this huge problem and didn't have the capacity to solve it. So embrace this word problem. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not even a 4-letter word, as the governor talked about this morning. It's a good word. And because there are problems, we all have jobs. If everything happened easily, without any chance for problem, then we would all be home. Problems are good. So let me ask you this. Can you solve world hunger? I want you to take about 1 minute and just talk to somebody next to you and exchange a couple of ideas on what you would do first to solve the world hunger problem. Take 1 minute. Go. There's always a risk in doing this because some people think they can leave when we do this. Close the doors. Now that wasn't so hard, was it? Everybody solve world hunger, no problem, right? Yeah, easy stuff. Now I use that because metaphorically we talk about a lot of our problems sometimes in that vein. We say, oh, you're trying to solve world hunger here. And I mentioned it before, I used that metaphor before when we talked about even at Toyota, one of the problems we found was that people were trying to solve world hunger on 1A3. So I'd love to know, and when I do this with small groups, I'm always interested to hear how people respond to that, and what is their approach. And I've heard a lot of different approaches. But the one most common approach is that people want to rush right in and ask, why are people hungry? Because they may have been even taught the 5 why method of problem solving. Very good method, by the way. But if we were to hand out Post-it notes to everybody in this room and gave them the wall back there and say, can you start putting some why, answering some of those questions, why people are hungry, and putting them on the wall back there, how long would that take us and how much wall would we need? It would be, I can't imagine when we would ever finish. We noticed that. We understood, we saw that was happening, that people were wanting to go straight into the 5 why method of problem solving. Did anybody wonder what the definition of hunger we were using was? Anybody talk about, well, let's define hunger? Yeah, wouldn't it be nice to know? Instead of trying to solve something we don't even know what the gap is. So you could say, well, maybe hunger is less than 1,100 calories a day. Now we know. Now we can start to gather data based on that one understanding. But no, we want to go 5 why many times. 5 why method is good. 5 why method applies when we know point of cause. So Mr. Ono, Taiichi Ono, one of the fathers of the Toyota production system, one of the fathers of lean, I guess he put this 5 why method together many years ago. But he assumed point of cause. Can you touch it, either physically or through a map or some way to see the problem? You can say, right there's where it's happening. Now I can say why. But if I start asking why, when the question is, why are people hungry, I may never stop asking the question, or I may make an assumption and go down a totally wrong path and end up spending time and effort and resources that we don't have to have little or no impact on the problem. So we had to rethink that. We had to revisit this idea of PDCA. And so we looked at these key phases, and any methodology that you use are going to have these same kind of phases. So you can plug them in anywhere you would think to plug them in. So the first one we talked about, just like with world hunger, let's clarify this problem. Let's make something that is vague clear. What is hunger? It's less than 1,100 calories. I don't know what the official UNICEF definition is, but let's say it's less than 1,100 calories. Now we know. Now we can start to see, well, how many people are hungry? Now, if we know how many people are hungry, are we ready to ask why? Still not ready. But we're getting an understanding. We're starting to understand the gap. So being very clear is one thing we talked about, and being very specific. I'll give you an example. I was working with this company that makes soap. You know, when you go into the bathroom and you get soap out, you know, believe it or not, people make those bags of soap. We don't think about those people sometimes, but I got a chance to work with this company. And we had 3 days once. We went in and they said, okay, let's do PDCA. Here's our problem. They said, we've got a lot of leakers. Is that clear and specific? Even those in the back, is that clear and specific? No, right? So I'm no brain scientist or rocket surgeon, but I did ask the question, you know, well, first of all, what's a leaker? And then I asked the question, well, how many do we have? Can you get some data on that? So I asked the quality department for this data, and I don't know if you guys have this situation in your organization when you ask for data. But the answer was, I'll get that for you. I'll go and get that right now. So I've worked with enough organizations to know not to take that answer. So I said, thank you so much. I'll tell you where we'll be. We're going to go to the distribution center, and we're going to do some activity over there, and while you're collecting the data, can you bring it to us when you get it? When do you think we got it? This was Tuesday. We were supposed to finish on Thursday. Friday. And you know what it said? It said, this is how many leakers we have. It didn't do me any good. There was no information there that really did us any good at all, except we have a lot of leakers. They were right. They had a lot. So we said, we have to get more clear. And we call those words, in our vernacular, we call them junk words. And a junk word is any kind of question or any kind of part of that initial statement that doesn't have any clarity around it. And the big problem with this is that it sets up a barrier to commitment with a lot of the folks you're trying to work with. Because if I'm trying to get some folks together to work on leakers, and I say, we got a lot of them. If I ask every one of you in here to define a lot, how many different definitions would we have? A lot. Right? We'd have a lot of different definitions. And some people, a lot is 1,000, and some people it's 10. But if I said we have 10 leakers, maybe people say, oh, okay, we can work on that in a couple of days. Let's go do it. So these junk words we call a barrier to commitment. Be clear and be specific. What are we trying to do? What is our focus? What gap are we trying to close? Junk words, take that out. Give you a little quiz here. Can you find the junk words in the first sentence? We already identified a lot, right? What about the second one? What about the third one? Any junk words in that third sentence? What about expensive? What about to? What about just? What about luxury? We all have a different definition of what those things are. Very old, extremely heavy, far. How far is it? Is it blocks? If you've ever been to New York City, you know that in one direction, 3 blocks is not that hard. In the other direction, you'll be walking a long time. There's a junk word, right? A long time. You'll be walking 10 minutes and 37 seconds. How's that? But we got to get to the point where we clear out these junk words. Even in our meetings, when people are trying to discuss problems, they use these words. Ask for clarity. What is the clear definition of what we're shooting for? So that's the first phase. Let me give you a couple of visuals for this work we did in the distribution center when we couldn't get the data. We went to the distribution center itself, and we looked for every container in that entire distribution center that had a leaker in it. And you could kind of see the picture in the top left hand. When one bag would leak, it would contaminate sometimes 10 or 20 or 30 cases or cartons of these packages here. So one could mean a lot of cost. So we grasped the situation. We went over there, we counted every one of them. Now, Mr. Ono, I told you about before, he had this saying about, sometimes you have to get your hands dirty when you solve a problem. So we were trying to be cute, and we changed that a little bit because we were dealing with soap. Some of you are finishing the sentence already, right? Sometimes you got to get your hands really clean to solve a problem. So we looked at each one of these. We took every one of them apart. We gathered our own data. We took that data and started to make some sense out of it. But the key message around that first step is don't wait. Sometimes you got to gather your own data. Sometimes you got to sit down and understand the process and sit next to the people who are doing it and gather the data yourself. Second part we wanted to focus on was refocus on this idea of problem breakdown. World hunger is huge. So we've got to ask different questions, not just why people are hungry. We've got to ask different questions in order to break that problem to a different level. Now, anybody ever seen one of these broccoli farms? You got any of these in Washington State? Like this? Most people don't realize that broccoli grows on these enormous trees and you just kind of break it down into smaller chunks, into the chunk you finally get in the produce section. We use this analogy, and I've started to listen to a lot of our students, and they just use the word broccoli and breaking the broccoli down so many times. And I think it's appropriate because if you take a big stalk of broccoli, next time you look at it, take one of those branches off and compare the two. The big chunk that it came from and that chunk looks very similar. Take another chunk off the smaller one and set it next to it and start to compare all three. They look very similar. If you get a little microscope, you can start to see all the similarities. And then take another chunk and another chunk and another chunk until you get down to this little bitty small piece of broccoli that looks very similar to that very large piece of broccoli. And this is where people lose patience. They want to eat the whole broccoli now. They want to choke on it. And some of us don't even like broccoli. And we want to eat it. Sometimes it's better with a little cheese, by the way. But if we have that small piece of broccoli and we can solve that small piece of broccoli, we can learn a tremendous amount about all those other pieces of broccoli up to the large one. But we don't trust that process enough. We want the whole thing and we want it now. Instead of taking the breakdown, solving the smaller chunk, we do two things. We build our capacity, we build our problem-solving muscles so we can solve bigger problems in the future. Plus, we learn a tremendous amount about that bigger problem. Think about that from the aspect of world hunger. If I break world hunger down into all these smaller subsections, and I solve some small subsection of this world hunger problem, that went from we have a big vague problem down to maybe we ask the breakdown questions, we get down to the smaller part of a village somewhere that's hungry. And we solve that problem, we learned a lot about the other problems. But we're not patient enough many times to do that. So graphically, it might look like this, world hunger being that large, vague problem. And if you look at the questions on the breakdown side, on the right side, the questions are things like what, where, when, who, how much, how many, how often. And that list of questions is missing one question. It's conspicuously absent. The question why is not there yet. It takes tremendous patience to put why to the side. So when I was in the distribution center with those folks who were looking for the leakers, how many times do you think I had to listen to why it's happening and the solutions? They had it all figured out. Now, they've been doing this for 10 years trying to figure it out. But they had it all figured out. Again, one more time. And just the patience. Please, let's just gather the data. Let's just understand this problem. We're not here to solve it yet. Let's just understand the problem. Break it down. Find the data. And we break it down to the point where we get to what we call point of cause, which helps us then with root cause. Now, if you see the breakdown here, you see like if the pink represents tough problems. Now, in that second level, we still have 3 problems, and we take one and break it down further. Are those other 2 no longer problems? Of course not. They're still problems. They're just not the problem we're going to focus on right now. We're going to focus on this part of it. And guess what? We have the luck of being able to go back and pick up those other 2 problems in the future after we learn more deeply about the one section we're going to focus on. Break down the problem. Find what we call the division points, those questions on the right. How do we divide the data to understand? So maybe if you think about world hunger, what is one question we could ask at the beginning to start to give us a breakdown? And one of the questions people would come up with is, well, we have 7 continents. Maybe we could start there. And one is mostly not inhabited, so let's start with 6 continents. What's hunger look like on those 6 continents? It's one level of breakdown. And maybe from that data we find out that it's the African continent that has the most hunger. All the other continents, are they no longer problems? Of course they are. But we're going to focus on the area that gives us our biggest, in a sense, bang for the buck. And we start to break it down by region again. So where are people hungry? And if I ask the question, who's hungry? We could break it down in so many different ways. We could break it down by age group. We could break it down by gender. We could break it down by so many different ways. Till we get down to the point where we figure out that children that are 5 and under that live in this region of sub-Saharan Africa have less than 1,100 calories to eat in the fall of the year after the harvest. It's much different than world hunger. But if we learn how to solve that problem, we could have a huge impact on world hunger. But it's got to be broken down. In our work in the distribution center, we did that. We gathered all the data. We made a map of like the front of the bag and the back of the bag, and we just made a little check mark. We used the most simple tools. Let's make a check mark. We found out about 60% of all the leakers happen in where that little nozzle came out. There's a little weld around that nozzle. So we said, this is promising. Let's understand more deeply what we have here. We also looked at by date, by machine, by operator, to understand deeply about this problem. Yet, we still hadn't solved it. Now, we also have the transactional side of lean, which most of us are involved in, which would be more the administrative side. And this is an example of someone who took a large, vague problem in the mortgage company I was mentioning earlier and understood by mapping out the process and seeing the flow and gathering the data at different parts of that process where they got down to the point where they could see what points of the process were most challenging. And they wanted to focus right on that one area, what they thought was the point of cause. So it doesn't matter whether you're in a transactional environment, administrative environment like that, or whether you're in a manufacturing environment. If it's a flow and a process and a customer, then the process works. PDCA, simple. Now, this next part was a little controversial, and it still is. As controversial as PDCA can be, I don't know, it's not going to make the headlines or, be on Entertainment Tonight or anything, but, it's still for us, it was controversial. Because now we're going to set a target. And people would say, well, didn't we set the target already? It was to solve world hunger. And then the answer is no. We did a lot of work to break it down. Now we want to look at how do we solve the problem of, for example, getting the crop in the ground in 2 weeks instead of 4 weeks in this one village. So we look at problem. Now we want to set the target based on that, not on world hunger again, so we can have an impact. But in our target setting, we want to be very specific and clear again. Do what? To what? How much by when? Reduce the time it takes to plant the crop from 4 weeks to 2 weeks by the end of December 2012. Simple. But yet, many times, we have to go back and forth to make sure that it's very clear. So in our target setting, when we found the weld where the problem was, so instead of saying we're going to eliminate leakers, we said we're going to eliminate leakers caused by the weld seam by the end of the week. Much different than it was before. In a transactional setting, you can see things look like this: to increase capacity, to hit the goal in the EOQ2 from 16% to 50% by some date. Same thinking way. Whether you're making something, or you're making decisions, or you're making things in a transactional environment. What this allowed us to do, this is part of the revisiting, is to have a much more focused root cause analysis. So instead of having world hunger as our problem, the root cause, and say why, now we're saying, why is this village, kids 5 and under? In the leakers, we're saying, why do we have leakers on this part of the bag? So we have a much different way to look at it. So for the example I was showing you on the leaker part, we gathered our data, we did a quick root cause analysis, look at the possibilities, we did our why. We actually found the point on the machine where the bag went together with the weld. And as you can see there, we found that there was one part that had been overused and not been changed out. On the left side is the new part, on the right side is the old part. And even if you look closer at that, one side of it was a little more worn than the other. And therefore, there was one part of the seam that leaked more often. So we did a lot of work, a lot of picking up of boxes, a lot of going through these nasty, if soap can be nasty, but it was pretty nasty if you just got your hands in it all day. And we found the point of cause in 2.5 days. They'd been working on this problem for months and months, and in some cases years. But because we had a disciplined process, we were able to take a chunk of that, not the whole thing, and find the point of cause. Now, any of you ever have this happen in your organization? Is that common? We call that the 5 who's to get the root blame. You know, sometimes it turns into that. But if we look process and just try to figure out what the problem is, we get more like even in this transactional environment where the person looked at the point of cause, did their whys, as you can see, why did it happen, why, and then they get to what they think is root cause. And even some of you can see even the one right below the top line, the second line, it didn't go out to root cause. They eliminated that as a possibility. But they stayed true to the process. Why, root cause. Now, are they geniuses and they know exactly what the root cause is and no other work needs to be done? Absolutely not. It's a scientific method. They think this is root cause. Now what do they have to actually do? Put some countermeasures in place to actually see if they were right. We don't know we're right. We think we're right. We've done a lot of work to understand, but we're going to keep on going. So we go and we implement our countermeasures. We figure out what the cause is. And then ultimately we have to check both our process and our results. From not only the agency viewpoint, from the customer's viewpoint, from your own viewpoint, did you get developed as an individual? Did the agency close their gap? And did the customer ultimately get what they wanted? And from a lean perspective, we use the word customer to mean simply the next step in the process, not necessarily the end user, but who gets something from me? Do they get what they need, when they need it, in the amount that they need? That is my customer. We did that with our project in the distribution center. We looked at what went well, what didn't go so well. Did we have the right people involved? Did we close the gap? Did the people feel like they were developed? And there was a sense of energy at the end of this process that people, first of all, were absolutely shocked. Their mouths were kind of falling open. Oh my gosh, I can't believe we solved a chunk of this problem in 2 days, in 3 days. So there was a lot of spirit of really wanting to keep going, really wanting to try the next one. And so we got the one well taken care of. What about the other leakers? How do we solve that? It's the same method. So why do we want to check both results and process? And I've used this little 2x2 many times with many companies. I was working with a private equity company once and I showed them this. I said, what's most important, process or results? What do you think their answer was? Results. They didn't want to see anything else. We want results. That was 5 years ago. I'm still working with that private equity company. And over the past year, they are very, very concerned about how they get the results they get. They've actually been featured in a magazine article recently about the process they use and the way they try to develop the people and the organizations so that when ultimately that company is sold, it's not what we hear, in some examples recently of this kind of work. They try to build a leadership team and a team of people that can actually do the work next year and the next year and the next year because they believe in both of these now. So what's it look like for us? So we say anybody knows, all of us would want to have great process and great results, that top right-hand quadrant. Everybody knows that nobody wants bad process and bad results. When I'm talking about process, what I mean is that we know how we got what we got. We know the process we use to get the results we got. Those of you who have had the pleasure of trying the nails, there's probably 5% of you who walk up and these nails fall apart when you pick them up. And then I asked the question, I said, how'd you do that? I don't know. And I told one this morning, I said, we almost promoted you. You were so good, we almost gave you a promotion on the spot, and now you tell me you don't know what you were doing. I don't understand. And so then we go through the process. How do you learn it so you can repeat it? And that's when the big decision comes down culturally. From a cultural perspective, from a leadership perspective, from an agency perspective, which one do we choose? Which one do we prefer? To know exactly how we got a subpar result, or to get a better result and have no idea how we got it? For most of us, that's an easy answer. But if you're really responsible for results every day, it's a tougher one. But building the culture, we would say, we prefer to know exactly how we got whatever result we got over not knowing how we got the result that we got. Because we call that luck. And the other side, we say, that's our opportunity to learn. So many of the agencies in the state have started a lean journey. Some of you are many months down the road. Some of you are very frustrated at the point you're at. If you're just worried about the results, then your frustration is going to lead to you abandoning ship at some point. Say, this is not worth it. I don't care what the governor said. It is flavor of the month. It's flavor of the month at Toyota too, but it's been every month for 70 years. So we're used to it, I guess. Even if you're frustrated at the point you are right now, if you adopt this thinking, you're constantly working through this PDCA cycle. Is how do we learn from this? And how do we get a little better? And get a little better? And get a little better? Because I cannot go from the X to the zero. I can't go from luck to the zero, to the O, to the good results and good process. But I can go from the learn to the O at the top. I can make it there because I know how I did it. I know the process I use. I can repeat it. I can teach it. Simple, 2x2. I personally love it. I use it all the time to help explain part of what we're trying to do with lean. Process and results. Grow the people and get the results as we go through. The last and one of the most critical steps of this process is called standardize. And for some of you, it is a dirty word. It is the 4-letter word. But it is vital. If we do a Kaizen, if we do an improvement, we must lock in those improvements with standardization. Mr. Ono said, without standardization, there is no Kaizen. And so he meant that on two sides. On the first side, if we don't have a standard to start with, and we do something different to quote unquote improve, we haven't improved it, we've added one more level of variation, which most of us know that's on the wrong track. But he also said, if we do a Kaizen, we do an improvement, and we don't standardize that, we just wasted our people. Some of you probably have heard of the 8 wastes. There's 7 wastes plus the non-traditional waste of wasting human capital, our imaginations, our minds. That's a classic example of wasting of human beings. We go through all the effort and energy of actually making an improvement. We don't standardize it. Next week, it goes away. What we just said to the people was, we don't care what you did. It's gone. I was in a manufacturing plant a few weeks ago, and this one guy actually went out for surgery. He had a hernia. And we were tracking down these Kaizens that people had done, and I went to find him and see the Kaizen. Well, he took me over to his area, and the card he had made to help prevent the next person from getting the hernia, it was sitting in the corner all dusty, and he said, I liked it when I was over here. What they told him basically was, all that effort you put into making this improvement, we don't care anymore. That's the 8th waste. That's wasting of a human being. So we must standardize. We get to the point, we go up this ladder. We have a success, we standardize, we Kaizen again, we standardize, we Kaizen up the ladder to build our capability, build our people. But we must have that. So we have the 8 phases. Again, call them steps, call them phases. It fits into whatever. If you have a 6-step process, a 4-step process, the phases are there. We've got to be very clear. We've got to break the problem down. We've got to set a target based on that broken down problem. We've got to do our root cause analysis. We've got to develop the countermeasures, implement them, check the results and process, standardize, and then you're still not finished. When we do PDCA classes, we always ask people now, what's your next PDCA? Because the cycle never ends. And it's not a cycle like this where you never go anywhere. It's a cycle that goes upward. We're trying to continually grow in our people again and solve harder and harder problems. Why do we do that? The graphic at the bottom explains kind of where we want to be. There's a sweet spot that has the right amount of planning that leads us to the right amount of activity. We check to see how we did, and we make adjustments, and then we can actually move to the next one. But what we see a lot is the ready, fire, aim approach. Let's just do, skip the planning, do. Then we check it, it goes on forever, and then maybe it just fades away. That's what we call flavor of the month. It fades away. And then we look for the next thing. Part of this is, and I've noticed this especially in this part of the country, there's an affinity for nature, and there's an affinity for natural things, and part of this idea comes from this affinity for nature. An idea we would consider to be a sacred thing, like a tree. So we even have a term we call nemawashi. It says prepare the soil. So as we're going through the PDCA process, we're constantly working with groups of people, constantly getting what we might call buy-in to our solutions and our ideas and our problems that we're trying to define. And instead of that fading out, instead of that idea, this fading into nothingness, we nurture it and we grow it to where it really takes root and we solve the problem. The other side of that would be, let's just plant 100 trees. Maybe one of them lives, 99 die, so what? We'll plant some more. And we grow another level of cynicism in our organizations when we don't do that proper level of plan, do, check, act, or adjust. Very simple again, but also vital and hard to implement. Example of another completed A3. Now this one is pretty extensive, but I hope you also notice it's very visual. I want to emphasize the idea of how we visualize the problem, we visualize the gaps. And this one also is good because of the color coding. We try to, in some of the problem solving we do, to try to say, okay, where the countermeasures going back to the root causes, and then the countermeasures that we put in place also color coded. This is a way to be able to communicate more clearly, as an example. For those of you who have an opportunity then to learn what we might call the improvement kata, I know there's a session called the problem solving kata, or the coaching kata, the Toyota kata, that some people call it, which is just a routine. Then we also think about coaching PDCA at that level and asking the proper questions. So once we are getting good at PDCA ourselves, how do we bring other people with us? And so developing into good coaches, asking the right questions at the right phase to push the folks forward, to build that skill is a very important part of continuing the PDCA cycle. So hopefully you'll have a chance to learn more about the Toyota Kata that I think the course is called, or the PDCA Kata. So I want to take an opportunity to get some questions. If we could, I have a microphone. If you have a question, if you want, we can have somebody take the microphone out, get a question, and I can answer it up here with the other one. So any questions, we can take those now. Those that are leaving, nice to meet you.
Thanks. Hi, my question was, when you showed the slide with like problem, and then kind of delineated out the pink area of problems. Mm-hmm. My experience is you may be focusing on that pink problem, but it is inextricably linked to the other problems that are linked to other problems. So how do you really separate out a problem and just work that one piece?
Right, and I think on the world hunger part of that, people would say, well, one of the approaches people take was, well, let's look at the logistics of getting food to people at the right places. And so I think what happens is we get in kind of this paralysis of analysis in a sense. And so instead of just taking the problem and saying, well, we've got to deal with all of it, is sometimes what we'll do with that strategically is say, well, let's have multiple efforts across that problem with maybe the strategy or what we call the Hoshinkanri, kind of linking those together. So if we have a huge problem we need to have a lot of people working on, a lot of teams working on, we can address all of those. If we have limited resources, there's no way around the fact that sometimes we just can't focus on all of those. Then we need to make our best decision based on the data we have to try to close a small part of that gap and then quickly go back and get one of the next ones. And I think it comes to my experience has been, it comes down to the lack of patience of we must eat the whole broccoli or the whole elephant or whatever metaphor we want to use, and not have the patience to say, let's close this small gap, check and see if it's still there, go back and get another one, always monitoring what we've accomplished so we can keep the standard in place, try another one. Now, if we start to notice this is having an impact, obviously we need to understand that impact more deeply. And this is when we get into some of the other tools of PDCA. Some of us in this room are probably, black belt in Six Sigma. And so when you get into very complex problems, we need to have a much more complex statistical analysis. We will also work on the idea that, 80% of the problems we face in the organization can be solved by people at the source with simple means. So we have to have a full toolkit and a full understanding of the problem, and knowing that we may have to call in sometimes the bigger guns for those very complex problems. But a lot of it really is about the patience to break it down, solve the chunk, and go back and get the next one, I think. Thanks for the question, really good. Who else?
You just mentioned about small problems and big problems. So what I've noticed is this is a great process, but what about small problems, and what about them being solved at the lowest level? Sometimes they can be solved at the lowest level, but when do you choose to plug in the more formal process?
Yeah, and we call that process at the frontline level what we call Kaizen Teian, which has a couple of different purposes. One is to solve small problems, and the other is to gain a high level of involvement and engagement of the workforce based on the belief that people with simple methods at the source can solve problems. Now, at some point when we have a difficulty touching the point of cause, whether that be within a system or whether it be actually like the leakers being able to touch it, then if we can't do that, if we have layers above what we call the point of cause, it takes more analysis. Now, there's no definite formula for that, but just generically speaking, we say, if I can touch point of cause, I can do 5 whys. If I can't touch point of cause, I have to ask where and when and how much and how many in order to understand and analyze that problem a little bit more so I can eventually get to that point. But when we're talking about Kaizen Teian, we're talking about people who are working with the process every day. And once they're trained to understand and see waste, many times they can say, oh, I can touch point of cause, why, countermeasure quickly, and I have what I call a Kaizen. I standardize that in place as well. So it's an art and science, but once you get into the mode of understanding where point of cause is, then it may lead you to more, and again, we showed the 3 levels of problem solving, right? When in reality, there's, countless levels. And they when you're close to the line, it's easier. But when you're far close to the line, it's harder. When you're far from that line, it's easy. But the more we practice it, and the more we do our own check and adjust on our process, the more we know that if we got the right amount of analysis, or if we should have handled that with just a quick, easy Kaizen. And I can, I'm thinking as I'm saying this, a couple of examples where people have presented. I want to do PDCA on this. I want to do an A3. And really, you could put a solution in place because you can see point of cause. Why do an A3 when it's really simple and easy right in front? And if we're wrong, the worst thing that can happen is we go back and we do more analysis. So hope that helps a little bit. Good.
I'm Eva Fasthorse from LNI, and I did an A3, and when I first looked at it, it was just a blank page. And so as a question for you, what would you advise when I do a second one? Do I put too much on there? Do I put too little? Do I try to put medium? And you say it's visual. I had some visual on there, but I think some were a lot and some wasn't. So what is your advice for a good A3?
Yeah, and I'm looking for some of my other LNI friends in here, like Roy over there. First, let me tell you a little story about when I was learning to do this. And I actually was out of the plant once, and I was in some other location, and somebody called me and said, "Hey, Daryl, can you put together an A3 real quick on the status of this thing where we're putting in place and make it visual?" Okay, I was pretty new to the process, and so I got on my computer and I filled this document with a bunch of clip art, and I think they're still laughing about that now. And I remember my teacher, my sensei, my teacher, my boss, he said, "Oh, Daryl-san, really? This is not visual. This is clip art. Let me show you." So he taught me what he meant by visual. So the key point there is, I think, is having, when you're new at this, and the folks that I worked with at LNI, and Roy can attest to this, maybe 27 iterations back and forth. So find somebody within LNI who has some experience and get some coaching, step-by-step coaching. And I have another friend, he may be in this room, I don't know, but he sent me his A3 once. He said, "This is good." He finished it. He sent it all the way from step 1 to step 8. And I looked at the problem, and my first question was, "What's the problem?" I didn't finish reading it. I sent it back to him and said, "I could have saved you a lot of time. What problem are you trying to solve here?" Not sure. It was beautiful. It had a lot of pictures on it, a lot of graphs and charts and data, but we didn't know what problem it was. So find somebody who has some experience, get some coaching. I personally served that function, even now unofficially for a lot of the students that I had. And one thing I learned the hard way, I guess, was when someone gives you that feedback, and we've heard the cliches, feedback is a gift. And just because it's a cliche doesn't mean it's wrong. And if it's really given in the spirit of a gift, and I got a lot of gifts over my time when I was at Toyota, when I would give my A3, step-by-step direction, not finish it, step-by-step. And I would get that back with so many red marks on it. And at first it was like, it would break my heart. And then someone said, really, what that is a sign of respect. Disrespect would have been giving it back and saying, yeah, it looks good. But respect was, I'm going to take the time to really look, really understand, and really try to give feedback on this. And it goes back and forth. So we didn't go into the details of courage, humility, and Kaizen, but that's a real opportunity to practice courage, to ask for the feedback, and the humility to accept it. And that's a real key to lean, I think, from a cultural perspective, is balancing courage and humility in order to give us an opportunity to Kaizen. Good. Hope that helps. Anybody else? I think we have like 2 more minutes, so maybe one more question. Okay, it's that time, I think. So thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. I'll see you outside.